A racist white woman humiliates a black man on a plane, only to be shocked by who he truly is. As David Brooks boarded Flight 526, he noticed the uneasy stares. One in particular lingered, a woman with a look that went beyond curiosity. Her glare held judgment. Beth Parker's eyes narrowed as she tracked David's every movement. To her, there was something unsettling about a black man like him seated so confidently. The mere sight of him navigating the narrow aisle made her uncomfortable, though she'd never admit it. As David placed his bag in the overhead compartment, Beth's fingers tightened around her own carry-on. She glanced nervously at the emergency exit beside him, her thoughts racing with assumptions. Unable to contain her discomfort, Beth signaled to Sophie Carter, a flight attendant passing by. Her voice was low yet dripping with suspicion. "Is it safe to have someone like him sitting there?" Sophie's calm professionalism never faltered. "Ma'am, every passenger has been thoroughly screened. He's exactly where he should be." Beth frowned, dissatisfied. "You never know these days," she muttered. Her gaze returned to David as he opened his book, her suspicion growing, each turn of the page intensifying her unease. "Before we dive into this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, let's get started." Beth's eyes rarely left David, tracking his every move with the same quiet scrutiny. He had barely opened his book when she saw him reach down into his bag once again, his hands careful, deliberate. To most, this would be a casual act, perhaps adjusting something in the bag or retrieving a belonging. But to Beth, it was a sign, a signal that there was something he didn't want others to see. Her mind raced. Why is he checking that bag so often? What's he hiding in there? The more she watched him, the more her imagination filled in the blanks, forming assumptions built on nothing more than her discomfort with his presence. The tension between her fingers tightened further, her knuckles going white as she continued to stare. She could feel her heart racing, her own body responding to the story her mind was spinning. David, blissfully unaware of the intense scrutiny, settled back into his seat and sipped a bottle of water he'd just taken from his bag. The calmness in his posture, his quiet contentment, seemed to unsettle Beth even more. How can he be so calm? So composed? Her unease only grew as she watched him, her thoughts descending further into her own prejudices. Unable to take it any longer, she raised her hand, flagging Sophie once more as she passed by. Sophie paused, her calm expression unfazed as she addressed Beth. "Ma'am, is there something I can assist you with?" Sophie asked, her voice as steady as before. Beth leaned forward, lowering her voice to a whisper. "That man," she said, gesturing towards David with a slight nod. "He keeps checking his bag, like he's hiding something in it. I really think you should look into it." Sophie glanced at David, who was simply reading, then back to Beth. "Ma'am, as I mentioned before, all passengers on this flight pass security screening. Unless there's a specific cause for concern, I'm unable to inspect his personal belongings." Beth's lips pursed, clearly displeased. "People are too trusting these days. We can't just ignore something suspicious because of politeness." Sophie maintained her professional composure. "If you notice anything specific, please let us know. Otherwise, we ask that all passengers respect each other's privacy." Beth huffed quietly, crossing her arms. Her gaze shifted back to David, her mind unable to let go of the growing sense of unease, each page he turned only stoking her distrust further. Beth's frustration simmered, building with every passing moment. She couldn't understand how the flight attendants, or anyone else for that matter, weren't seeing the potential threat she felt was so obvious. Her gaze never left David as he flipped another page in his book, his calm demeanor fueling her suspicions. This time, she didn't wait for Sophie. Beth flagged down Sophie once more, her voice tense and insistent. "I'm telling you, this man is up to something," she hissed. "You need to check his bag before it's too late." "Excuse me, but I don't think you understand the urgency of this situation," she insisted, her voice just above a whisper but edged with tension. "I am certain there's something dangerous in that man's bag. He's checking it constantly, like he's nervous someone will find out what he's hiding. Sophie took a deep breath, keeping her professional demeanor intact. She'd handled many difficult passengers in her career, but there was something about Beth's insistence that struck her as troubling. Ma'am, as I mentioned before, unless there's a visible threat or specific reason, we cannot intrude upon another passenger's belongings. Beth's voice grew firmer, her frustration spilling over. This isn't just about privacy, this is about everyone's safety. You people think you're trained for these things, but you don't know what you're up against. People like him, they know how to hide things. Her words hung in the air, sharp and full of an unspoken prejudice that even Sophie couldn't ignore. Sophie's gaze softened, yet her expression grew serious as she replied, Ma'am, I assure you that the safety of every passenger is our top priority. We also strive to ensure a respectful environment on board. Please return to your seat. Beth's face flushed with anger, but she forced herself to turn away, muttering under her breath, You'll regret this. Everyone's too blind to see the danger until it's too late. She stormed back to her seat, casting one last, long glare at David as she sat down. Her mind was racing, fuming with frustration. How can they be so naive? Am I the only one willing to protect everyone here? Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, noticing her agitation. She caught the eye of an elderly woman seated next to her and leaned in, lowering her voice conspiratorially. I don't know if you've noticed, she began, her tone dripping with caution, but that man near the exit, he's been acting suspiciously. Keeps checking that bag of his, like he doesn't want anyone to know what's inside. The elderly woman glanced over at David, then back at Beth, hesitant. He seems fine to me, she replied gently, visibly uncomfortable. Maybe he's just reading. Beth clenched her jaw, frustration tightening her face. It's people like you who get us all in trouble, she whispered sharply. Unable to sway anyone, Beth sank back into her seat, her resentment now bubbling into anger. She vowed to keep a close eye on David, convinced that if no one else would act, she'd be ready the moment he made a wrong move. Beth's suspicions had grown into a near obsession. She watched David relentlessly, her mind racing with what-ifs, each more dramatic and fear-inducing than the last. With every shift he made, every time he reached toward his bag or glanced around the cabin, she convinced herself further that her instincts were correct. The plane's engines roared as they climbed higher, yet in her mind, the real danger was seated just a few feet away. A few rows ahead, David remained unaware of the silent storm brewing behind him. He'd adjusted his seatbelt, settled in with his book, and now seemed entirely at ease, lost in the words on the page. To Beth, though, his calmness was a facade, a performance that only heightened her mistrust. Her thoughts churned. How can he act so normal? Doesn't anyone else see through it? The young man glanced up, looking over at David for a brief moment before turning back to her, an eyebrow raised. I mean, he looks fine to me. Probably just reading, ma'am. Beth's face tightened in disappointment. That's what everyone says until something happens, she muttered, loud enough for those around her to hear but directed at no one in particular. She shook her head, her frustration spilling over as she noticed several passengers subtly looking her way with confusion, some even with slight irritation. Just then, David took a moment to reach down and retrieve a small bottle of water from his bag, twisting off the cap and taking a sip. Beth's eyes were locked onto him, her gaze intense, reading far more into his actions than was truly there. Her imagination painted every movement with suspicion, every gesture with hidden intent. To her, even a simple drink of water looked like a cover for something far more sinister. With each minute that passed, Beth's anger and impatience mounted. She flagged Sophie down once more, her tone sharper, more insistent than before. I'm telling you, this man is up to something, she hissed. You need to check his bag before it's too late. You can't just sit back and ignore a threat because of politeness. Sophie's patience, though professional, was wearing thin. She took a deep breath, her voice calm but firm. Ma'am, as I've explained, every passenger has gone through security screening. We have protocols to ensure everyone's safety, and we're following them. Unless there is a specific reason to believe otherwise, we cannot disturb other passengers. Beth's voice rose slightly, catching the attention of even more nearby passengers. Specific reason? Isn't his behavior enough of a reason? He's too calm, he's hiding something, and it's right there in his bag. Several passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, their curiosity piqued by the tense exchange. Sophie could see the unease spreading through the cabin and knew she had to de-escalate the situation. "Ma'am, I understand that you're concerned, but I need to ask you to keep your voice down. If you continue to disrupt other passengers, I'll have to involve the captain." Beth bristled at the warning, her face flushed with indignation. "So you'll report me for trying to keep everyone safe, but won't even check his bag? That's ridiculous." Her voice carried through the cabin, causing heads to turn and murmurs to ripple among the rows. She sat back, crossing her arms tightly, her entire posture radiating resentment. David finally looked up, feeling the shift in atmosphere around him. His eyes met Beth's for the first time, confusion flickering across his face as he noticed her glare. He held her gaze for a moment, puzzled, then offered a polite nod before returning to his book. The courtesy only seemed to agitate Beth further. Just then, the elderly woman seated next to Beth leaned over, her voice soft but resolute. "Young lady," she whispered, "perhaps it's best to let things be. We're all just trying to have a peaceful flight." Beth's expression hardened as she glanced at the woman, barely containing her irritation. "You don't understand. People like him, they're not as harmless as they seem." The elderly woman's eyes widened in silent disapproval, but she chose not to respond, sensing that nothing she could say would change Beth's mind. With each passing minute, Beth's anxiety continued to mount. Her fingers tapped rhythmically on the armrest, her mind racing as she imagined scenarios that only deepened her fear. She was on edge, her nerves stretched to the breaking point, convinced that she was the only one who could see the truth. As the plane cruised high above, the tension Beth created was as thick as the clouds outside. She vowed to stay vigilant, her mistrust and anger bubbling under the surface, waiting for the slightest excuse to explode. Beth's patience had worn thin, and her suspicions were now an unstoppable force. She watched as David reached for his bag once more, adjusting it under his seat, and that was the final straw. She couldn't sit back any longer, not when she believed everyone's safety was at stake. With determination, Beth unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, ignoring the stares of nearby passengers. Her steps were quick and purposeful as she made her way down the aisle, stopping right beside David's seat. Her voice was loud enough to draw attention but restrained enough to sound reasonable, at least in her own mind. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone sharp and unyielding. David looked up, surprised by her sudden approach. "I think it's about time you show us what's in that bag. You've been checking it repeatedly, and it's making the rest of us uncomfortable." David blinked, caught off guard. His eyes met hers, and he could see the suspicion and tension etched into her face. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand. This is just my personal bag, nothing more," he replied calmly, his voice steady. Beth crossed her arms, her glare unwavering. "That's what they all say," she snapped. "But it doesn't explain why you keep looking into it. If there's nothing to hide, then you shouldn't mind showing it to us, right?" By now, several passengers had turned to watch the unfolding confrontation. The atmosphere grew tense as people exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the scene. Sophie, noticing the commotion, quickly approached, her expression serious. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," Sophie said, her tone polite yet firm. "We've spoken about this already, and I assure you, there is no cause for concern." Beth turned toward Sophie, frustration clear in her voice. "No cause for concern? This man has been checking his bag over and over. You're telling me that doesn't seem suspicious to you?" David, maintaining his composure, decided to speak up. "Ma'am, I have my medication in this bag. I check it because I need it accessible. I'm not hiding anything." Beth's expression twisted, unwilling to accept his explanation. "Medication? That's convenient," she scoffed. "People will say anything to avoid suspicion. How do we know you're telling the truth? Sophie stepped between them, her voice calm but firmer now. Ma'am, I need you to sit down and allow all passengers their personal space. This is not the place for confrontations. If you continue to cause a disturbance, I will have to notify the captain. Beth's face flushed with indignation, but she wasn't about to back down. Oh, so now I'm the problem for trying to keep us safe? She said loudly, glancing around as if seeking support from other passengers. No one else finds it strange that he's been acting this way? David kept his tone steady, looking at Beth with calm patience. Ma'am, I assure you, I have nothing to hide. Look, I understand that you're nervous, he said, addressing Beth directly. But please, I'm just trying to get through this flight like everyone else. If you have concerns, let the flight attendants handle it. Beth threw up her hands in exasperation, her voice rising. You people don't see it, do you? This is exactly how they fool us, by pretending to be calm and collected. Well, I'm not falling for it. At this point, Sophie placed a gentle but firm hand on Beth's shoulder. Ma'am, please. For everyone's comfort, I need you to take your seat and remain calm. This behavior is distressing other passengers. Seeing that she wasn't gaining support, Beth huffed and reluctantly returned to her seat. But as she sat down, her frustration was evident, her gaze still fixed on David, who had quietly resumed reading. The passengers around them, sensing the tension, whispered among themselves, some visibly uncomfortable, others silently sympathizing with David. Despite the resolution, Beth's suspicions hadn't dissipated. She crossed her arms tightly, her mind still racing with mistrust. As the plane continued its steady course, she convinced herself that if no one else would take action, she'd be ready to do it herself. Beth sat back in her seat, but her gaze stayed firmly locked on David, her suspicions far from eased. She muttered to herself, frustration bubbling over. This isn't right, she thought. How can everyone be so blind? She glanced around, hoping to see others who shared her concerns, but all she saw were sideways glances of discomfort from nearby passengers, some of whom were visibly bothered by her outbursts. The tension in the cabin was thick, the atmosphere tense and uneasy. David, still trying to ignore the commotion, felt the eyes on him but chose not to react. He knew better than to feed into the situation. Instead, he took a deep breath, refocusing on his book. But despite his calm exterior, the tension gnawed at him too. Sophie and another flight attendant, Evan, exchanged a quick glance from the front of the cabin. They'd seen situations like this before, but something about this one felt different. Sophie leaned toward Evan and whispered, "Keep an eye on the woman in 12B. If she keeps escalating, we may need to notify the captain." Just then, David sensed the tension had reached its peak. David decided it was time to clarify the situation. Taking a deep breath, he stood and spoke calmly. Quietly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, worn leather badge holder, and stood up calmly, making sure he had everyone's attention without raising his voice. "Excuse me," David said, his voice steady yet loud enough to carry through the cabin. Passengers around him looked up, curious, a few even relieved that he was addressing the tension directly. He held up his badge, the unmistakable insignia of law enforcement catching the light. "My name is Detective David Brooks. I'm an investigator with the Oakland Police Department. I'm currently on a special assignment, and I always keep my heart medication close for health reasons. That's why I've been checking my bag." Beth's face went pale, her eyes widening in shock. The calm, collected man she had assumed the worst about was, in fact, an officer of the law. She looked away, a sudden wave of embarrassment washing over her, but David continued, not to shame her, but to bring a measure of peace to everyone on board. "For the record," he added gently, "I understand that everyone has concerns, especially during a flight. But it's important that we don't let our assumptions guide us into unfair judgments. We all share this space, and the last thing any of us wants is conflict." The cabin was silent. A few passengers, visibly relieved, exchanged glances. Some nodded in silent respect, while others cast disapproving looks toward Beth, who had sunk down into her seat, avoiding everyone's gaze. David took a deep breath, sensing that he had successfully eased some of the tension, and sat back down, placing his badge and ID back into his pocket. Beth's lips trembled slightly, her fingers nervously gripping her armrests. She knew she had crossed a line, but the realization of how deeply she'd wronged him weighed heavily on her. Her mind raced, trying to justify her actions, but every excuse felt hollow. Across the aisle, an elderly man nodded toward David with an expression of quiet respect. "Thank you for your service," he said softly, loud enough for only those nearby to hear. David offered a small, gracious nod, acknowledging the man's words with quiet gratitude. For a few moments, there was nothing but the low hum of the plane's engines filling the air, a marked contrast to the tension that had dominated the flight. The passengers returned to their books, their screens, their thoughts, though many continued to steal glances at David, admiration now evident in their eyes. Beth, on the other hand, remained silent, staring out the window, her face flushed. She had started this confrontation certain she was in the right, but now, all she felt was shame. The realization that her assumptions had led her to misjudge someone so deeply unsettled her, leaving her with an uncomfortable truth she could no longer ignore. Sophie, watching from the aisle, felt a deep sense of respect for David's composure. She knew that situations like this could easily escalate, but he had handled it with a dignity and calmness that only someone with his experience and professionalism could possess. As David resumed reading, the atmosphere in the cabin softened. People seemed to breathe easier, the unspoken tension that had divided the cabin now replaced with a collective sense of reflection. For many, the lesson was clear: assumptions, particularly those based on appearances, could be misleading, and sometimes dangerously so. The weight of Beth's mistakes seemed to settle over the entire cabin. Sophie, now more determined than ever to ensure a calm, respectful environment for all passengers, made her way down the aisle and stopped beside Beth's seat. The murmur of whispers quieted as passengers watched, sensing that something important was about to be said. Beth looked up at Sophie, her face still flushed, her fingers fidgeting nervously in her lap. She was torn between embarrassment and a sense of lingering indignation, though the latter was beginning to dissolve under the weight of realization. "Ma'am," Sophie began, her voice gentle but unmistakably firm, "I understand that you had concerns, but we all need to remember the importance of respect and fairness on board. Making assumptions about someone based on their appearance or actions without understanding their reasons is not only unfair, it's distressing to everyone involved." Beth's eyes darted down, her voice barely a whisper. I thought I was protecting everyone." Sophie nodded, allowing a moment of empathy. "I know you were concerned, and I understand that flights can make people uneasy. But we have security measures in place to ensure everyone's safety before we even take off. When we let our own fears turn into assumptions, we risk creating conflict where there isn't any." Sophie's words were gentle but carried a weight that Beth could not ignore. Beth swallowed hard, her mind racing with thoughts she had not considered before. It was one thing to worry for her own safety, but she now understood how her actions had disrupted the peace of others. Seeing that Beth was struggling with her feelings, Sophie softened her tone. "Look, we all make mistakes. But what matters is what we learn from them. It's important to recognize when our fears might be leading us down a path that could hurt others, even if that was never our intention." Beth could feel the stares of those around her, and her cheeks flushed a deeper red. She managed a small nod, her hands wringing together in her lap. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I just thought." Sophie offered a kind, reassuring smile. "We appreciate your concern for everyone's safety. Just please remember, not everything we worry about is a true threat. We're all here to reach our destination together, safely and respectfully." Sophie then turned to the rest of the cabin, her voice steady and calm as she addressed all passengers. "Thank you all for your understanding and patience. We're committed to making this flight as comfortable as possible for everyone. If you have any concerns, please let our team know, and we'll handle it to the best of our ability." As she finished, Sophie gave a slight nod to David, a silent acknowledgement of his composure. He responded with a gentle nod in return, quietly grateful for her handling of the situation. Beth, sinking back into her seat, felt a lingering weight settle on her. She had believed herself to be acting out of caution, but now saw clearly how her assumptions had spiraled into something damaging and unfair. A quiet sense of shame filled her, a reminder of how quickly fear could turn to prejudice. The hum of the engines filled the silence that followed, and passengers turned back to their own routines. But the mood in the cabin had shifted. There was a collective understanding, a reminder of the importance of empathy and respect, especially in situations that called for patience over prejudice. As the plane settled into a steady, peaceful rhythm, the tension in the cabin began to fade. Passengers slowly returned to their books, their music, and the occasional quiet conversation. Yet, a faint awareness lingered, a reminder of the conflict that had just unfolded. People exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of empathy, understanding, and even relief. For David, however, the silence felt welcome, and he was glad to return to the comfort of his book, determined to let the matter rest. Beth, on the other hand, sat in quiet contemplation. Her earlier confidence and resolve had been replaced by a sense of self-doubt that left her feeling raw and vulnerable. The truth of her actions was now sinking in, and it came with a weight she hadn't anticipated. She looked out the window, her gaze fixed on the endless sky as if searching for clarity in the clouds. The elderly woman beside her, who had watched the entire incident, gently leaned over, breaking the silence. "Sometimes fear can lead us to see things that aren't there," she said softly, her words filled with a wisdom that only years of experience could provide. "It's a hard lesson to learn, but an important one." Beth turned to her, her face tinged with embarrassment, but grateful for the kindness in the woman's eyes. She managed a small nod. "I didn't mean for things to get out of hand. I thought I was doing the right thing." The woman gave a sympathetic smile, her voice calm and reassuring. "Intentions matter, dear, but so do actions. I'm sure you meant well. It's just, we have to remember that our fears aren't always truths. They're just possibilities." She paused, letting her words settle. "Sometimes, they're not even that." Beth nodded again, absorbing the words, feeling a sense of humility settle over her. She glanced toward David, who was still engrossed in his book, appearing as though nothing had happened. But she knew that her actions had left a mark, one that was likely harder for him to ignore than he let on. Meanwhile, Sophie made another round through the cabin, quietly checking on each passenger to ensure everyone was comfortable. When she approached David's seat, she stopped briefly, her expression softening. "Mr. Brooks, I wanted to thank you again for your patience. You handled everything with more grace than most would." David looked up, his expression sincere. "Thank you, Sophie. I know these things aren't easy for anyone, but I appreciate how you managed it. You kept things calm, and that's all anyone could ask for." Sophie smiled, nodding with gratitude. "If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask." With that, she moved on, attending to other passengers, her steady presence providing a sense of reassurance for everyone on board. For a moment, David watched her walk away, reflecting on the complexities of the situation. His mind drifted briefly, recalling other instances where he'd faced similar treatment. Each time, he'd made a conscious decision to approach it with dignity and patience, even though it wasn't always easy. Today, however, felt different. There was something about Beth's intensity, her refusal to see beyond her fears, that had struck a chord with him. But he reminded himself that letting go was often the best choice, for his own peace, if nothing else. Across the aisle, a young man who had witnessed the incident leaned over, addressing David quietly. "Sir, I just wanted to say, that was impressive. I don't think I could have handled it like that." David offered a warm, modest smile. "Thank you. Sometimes it's better to just let things play out, and not add more fuel to the fire." The young man nodded, clearly impressed. "Still, you showed a lot of patience. Not everyone could do that." David chuckled softly. "Life has a way of teaching us patience, even when we don't want to learn it." The young man smiled back, seeming to appreciate the sentiment. He returned to his seat, and David once again opened his book, finally feeling a sense of calm settle over him. Beth, however, couldn't escape the feeling of regret that now weighed heavily on her. She cast a final glance toward David, the realization of her actions settling in more deeply than before. Her fingers tapped nervously on the armrest, her mind racing with thoughts she struggled to silence. Her attention drifted back to the elderly woman, who had quietly observed her inner struggle. "It's never too late to make things right, you know," the woman said gently, offering her a small, encouraging smile. An apology, when sincere, can be a powerful thing. Beth felt a wave of vulnerability wash over her. Apologizing wasn't something she was used to, but she knew the woman was right. Still, the words wouldn't come easily. She took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage, rehearsing in her mind what she might say. The cabin remained quiet, the atmosphere calm but contemplative. Passengers seemed to have settled, but a new awareness was present, a shared recognition of the day's events and their meaning. It was a reminder, unspoken yet palpable, of the importance of empathy over judgment, of understanding over fear. David, feeling a quiet satisfaction with the peace now surrounding him, continued reading. Beth, wrestling with her pride and remorse, looked down, unsure of her next step but realizing that perhaps it was time to confront her actions honestly, for her own growth, if not for his forgiveness. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the plane's descent. Passengers shifted in their seats, fastening their seatbelts and preparing for the landing. The plane dipped lower, the familiar sights of the city below coming into view, and there was a palpable relief in the air as the journey neared its end. Beth felt her heart pounding as the wheels touched down, her mind racing through everything that had happened. Shame and regret lingered in every thought. She stole another glance at David, who was calmly closing his book and gathering his belongings. Her face flushed as she thought about the assumptions she'd made, assumptions that had hurt him deeply, even if he hadn't shown it. As the plane taxied to the gate, Sophie and Evan exchanged a knowing look, nodding to one another. They had discreetly notified airport security about the incident, as protocol required in cases where passenger behavior disrupted the peace. Sophie turned to Beth, her expression kind but resolute. "Ma'am, please remain seated for a moment," she said gently. "Security will be boarding shortly to have a brief word with you." Beth's eyes widened, panic and disbelief flashing across her face. "Security?" she stammered. "But I didn't do anything wrong. I was only trying to look out for everyone's safety." Sophie maintained her professionalism, though her voice softened with empathy. "Ma'am, we understand your concerns. But causing repeated disruptions on a flight is a serious matter. The officers just need to ask you a few questions." The murmurs of nearby passengers filled the cabin as they gathered their bags and prepared to disembark, many of them casting Beth sideways glances. She felt their eyes on her, a mixture of disapproval and curiosity. She sank lower into her seat, realizing that her attempts to protect others had only isolated herself. David rose from his seat, his expression calm and composed as he prepared to exit. He glanced at Beth, catching her eye one last time. In that moment, Beth felt an overwhelming urge to say something, anything, to explain herself or maybe even apologize. But the words seemed trapped, buried under the weight of her pride and the fresh humiliation she felt. Sensing her hesitation, David gave a small nod, a gesture that was both forgiving and resolute, as if to say he held no grudges but also carried no expectations. He turned and joined the flow of passengers exiting the plane, leaving Beth to confront the aftermath of her actions alone. As David stepped onto the jet bridge, he was greeted by a few quiet nods and murmured words of respect from passengers who had witnessed the incident. They understood the grace and patience he had shown, and some even offered him a subtle smile of solidarity. David returned each gesture with a gracious nod, grateful for the quiet support. Back in her seat, Beth felt the crushing weight of her actions, her mind replaying every moment. She now understood the impact of her assumptions and the pain they had caused, not only to David but to everyone around her. 2 security officers boarded the plane, approaching Beth with calm professionalism. "Ma'am, we'd like to ask you a few questions," one of them said, his voice firm but not unkind. As passengers filed out around her, Beth nodded, barely able to meet their gaze. She knew this was the moment she would have to face the consequences of her actions and perhaps, in time, reflect on the lessons she'd learned. Don't forget to subscribe for more eye-opening stories that reveal the truth behind actions and assumptions. Thank you for watching. David stepped off the plane, feeling the weight of the flight finally ease. The busy terminal, with its echo of travelers and the clinking of luggage carts, offered a refreshing sense of normalcy. Each step felt like moving further from the tension he had endured, a quiet relief settling in. As he walked down the jet bridge, a young woman from the flight approached, her expression a mix of gratitude and respect. "Excuse me, Mr. Brooks?" she said softly. "I just wanted to thank you. The way you handled everything back there, it was incredible. You kept your composure through it all." David nodded, offering a kind smile. "Thank you. Sometimes staying calm is all we can do." She returned his smile, clearly moved. "Watching you reminded me that patience really does make a difference." Other passengers from the flight passed by, offering him small, respectful nods and understanding glances. David felt a subtle connection with them, a shared awareness of what they'd all experienced, a reminder that dignity and resilience left a lasting impression, even on those who watched quietly. Back on the plane, Beth sat alone, collecting herself as the last few passengers filed out. The weight of her choices and the reality of her actions had settled over her, leaving her feeling exposed and humbled. As the last passengers exited, Beth remained seated, her face a mixture of regret and disbelief. Two airport security officers, waiting at the front of the cabin, approached her seat with a professional but firm demeanor. "Ma'am," one of the officers began calmly, "we understand there were some issues during the flight. We'd like to ask you to come with us for a few questions." Beth's eyes widened, her face flushing with embarrassment. She looked around, realizing that the flight crew and remaining passengers were watching her, their expressions a blend of curiosity and disapproval. "I was only trying to keep people safe," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." The officer maintained a neutral expression, his voice respectful but unyielding. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you about your actions during the flight." Beth nodded, her face flushed with regret, and silently followed the officers. As they exited the plane and stepped into the terminal, Sophie watched from the cabin door, her expression soft but resolute. She knew the importance of ensuring all passengers felt safe, but also understood the need to maintain fairness and respect. Today, that balance had been tested. In the terminal, David had paused to retrieve his luggage and noticed Beth being escorted by security. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, Beth felt an overwhelming urge to explain herself, to somehow make him understand her intentions. But no words came. The calm understanding in David's gaze conveyed something that made her look away, a reminder of his dignity in the face of her own shortcomings. The officers led Beth toward a quiet area for questioning, her mind still reeling from the day's events. She was left to confront her actions and reflect on the choices that had led her here. As David watched her disappear into the crowd, he took a deep breath, finally letting go of the tension he'd carried. He knew he would move on from this, as he always did, but he hoped, for her sake, that Beth would find something valuable in this difficult lesson. As Beth was led away by security, the atmosphere in the terminal grew quieter, a mix of relief and reflection settling over those who had witnessed the event. Passengers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others murmuring quietly about what they had just seen. A few even whispered words of support for David, grateful for his patience and grace. One man, who had observed everything, approached David with a sincere expression. "I just wanted to say, you handled that better than most people ever could," he said, his voice filled with respect. "It's not easy staying calm in a situation like that." David offered a modest smile, nodding in acknowledgement. "Thank you. Sometimes it's about remembering that everyone's going through something. I just tried to keep that in mind." Nearby, a young woman from the flight also stepped forward, gratitude evident in her gaze. "You showed a lot of strength up there." Watching you reminded me of how powerful staying calm can be. David accepted her kind words with a quiet humility. The warmth of their support was unexpected but comforting, a reminder that even in difficult moments, resilience left a mark on others. As he walked toward the exit, passengers offered him nods of respect, subtle gestures that acknowledged the dignity he had shown. And for David, those simple acts of recognition were enough to reaffirm his belief in the quiet power of patience and empathy. As David moved through the terminal, he noticed Sophie, the flight attendant, approaching with a soft smile, her face reflecting both relief and respect. She took a moment to gather her words before speaking. "Mr. Brooks," she began warmly, "I just wanted to personally thank you. I know today must have been exhausting. Your patience made all the difference." David returned her smile, sensing the genuine gratitude in her voice. "Thank you, Sophie. I appreciate how you handled everything up there. It couldn't have been easy for you either." Sophie nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Situations like these are never easy, but I've learned a lot from watching how you responded. Honestly, it's rare to see someone stay so composed in such unfair circumstances. You reminded everyone of what true patience looks like." David chuckled softly, a hint of humility in his eyes. "Sometimes it's just about choosing not to add more fuel to the fire. I figure the more I react, the worse it gets." Sophie's gaze softened. "Well, it worked. The way you carried yourself inspired many of us today, and I think you showed us all the power of staying calm and dignified, even when it's hardest." They shared a quiet moment of understanding, the shared experience of the flight creating a bond that words didn't need to express. Sophie extended her hand. "Thank you again for everything." David shook her hand warmly. "Thank you, Sophie. Your professionalism was invaluable up there." As they parted ways, Sophie gave him a final nod, admiration clear in her eyes. David walked away, feeling a renewed sense of peace, grateful for the small but profound connection made in the face of a difficult experience. As David left the terminal, a sense of calm washed over him. The day's events had tested him, yet he walked away with a renewed conviction in the values that had carried him through. Reflecting on the experience, he knew that patience and dignity were choices he would make again, no matter how difficult the situation. Around him, people hurried to their destinations, unaware of the quiet lessons unfolding in their midst. But for those on Flight 526, the impact of what they had witnessed lingered, a reminder of the dangers of prejudice and the power of empathy. Through his steady composure, David had shown them the strength of character that comes from treating others with understanding, even in the face of misunderstanding. For Beth, the lesson was harder to accept, but just as important. She walked away humbled, beginning to realize that fear and assumption had blinded her, leading her to a place she hadn't intended. The path to change would take time, but her experience left her with a truth she could no longer ignore. Judgment based on appearances could harm others and isolate herself. David knew he couldn't control the way others saw him, but he could control his response. And today, his response had left a lasting impact, a reminder that integrity and patience could dismantle even the most stubborn assumptions. Each step he took away from the terminal was a testament to the strength of quiet resilience, a strength that inspired those who saw it firsthand. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Join us as we continue to explore stories of resilience, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Together, we can bring about the change we want to see in the world. The echoes of the day's events faded, but the lessons remained, etched in the minds of those who had shared that flight, a silent promise to themselves to choose patience over prejudice, understanding over judgment, and to carry forward the quiet strength they'd seen in David Brooks.